This is part two of the lecture on information, and we will now start looking at the lenses for IT strategy. To look at how IT can be used strategically, you must know how information is affecting your entire industry and your own firm's place in it. This helps you understand what information is worth managing. Remember, we are in an epoch of abundance, and so we are actually inundated with data, and it's very important for us to figure out what information actually should be managed. So we are going to look at the three questions we need to use to spotting opportunity, or the three lenses. And the first lens is how information technology is affecting your entire industry. The second lens is your firm's place in it. And the last one is whether an IT asset creates sustainable competitive advantage. Now let's look at this in a combination. So the first lens was how IT affects the effect of IT on industry, and we use something called the 5 forces model, which we can kind of think of as a telescope. It zooms out to the level of your industry. We are looking at a broad overview from an eagle's eye vantage. It helps you understand how information technology is altering the rules of competition for every firm in your industry, including your arch rivals. The next one we look at is the value chain analysis, which is comparing your firm with respect to your competition. This kind of, think of it like a magnifying glass. It zooms in to compare your firm to its arch rivals on how it creates value. It helps you recognize where your firm can use IT to reimagine how it earns its keeps. What's the value of IT here? And finally, we look at the very narrow perspective, which is like a microscope, which is your competitive advantage of an individual IT asset, and we use the competitive litmus test. And this zooms in on individual information technology assets and sees whether it can offer sustainable competitive advantage over the arch rivals. And this is important to use all of these together. So let's look at the impact of information technology on the 5 forces. And let's talk about the 5 forces model. So first, we have to understand that we are focused on an industry scale and not a firm level. So what makes an industry attractive, not the firm, is its profit potential. And so we're going to look at the 5 different forces, and all of it comes down to fierceness of competition. The fiercer the competition, the smaller the profit potential, basically less margins, and because there will be pressure on price, and it makes the industry more unattractive for a firm. So let's look at all the things that affect how fierce the competition is. Threat of new entrants. So more new people, the easier it is for new people to come in, the easier it is, the more fiercer the competition is going to be. Customers' bargaining power or negotiating clout. More power a customer has, obviously more fierce the competition is. Suppliers' bargaining power. Again, if suppliers have higher bargaining power, that affects and increases the competition. It basically, what it does is the bargaining power, as they increase, it erodes your profit margin, because when suppliers have more bargaining power, the costs increase. Customers have more bargaining power, your revenue decreases, and therefore that increases the profit margin. And finally, the threat of substitutes. It's like the new entrants, and we do have an issue of where the information technology, the trifecta, which breeds substitutes and allows industry outsiders to come in and capture the market. Example, book industry and Amazon with its Kindle. None of the publishers, big publishers, ever went into something like the Kindle, and they could have. Similarly, Apple coming up with iTunes, none of the music industry took, really paid much attention to it until Apple came in and wiped them out. So information technology, let's look at the impact there. First, it increases transparency because you just have more information. And that increases customers' bargaining power. Customers can go and look at items and then go and shop across different, they don't have to physically go there, they can look at it through the internet, and therefore it increases their bargaining power. And it does decrease suppliers' bargaining power because increased transparency for a firm allows the firm to do the same thing. Erasing geography. If you are in Florence, South Carolina, you're not stuck with Walmart here in South Carolina or Florence or 60-mile radius. You can basically shop on the internet and you can buy something from China. That increases your supplier's bargaining power, and of course it does increase the fierceness of competition because there are more number of firms competing in the landscape. It blurs industry boundaries. So let's take example of AT&T. AT&T used to be in, basically they used to sell telephone services. They used to sell telephones and telephone services. Then they went into cell phones. And let's take Time Warner Cable. Time Warner Cable was in internet and they provided TV, and the two were completely different industries. But take a look at it now. I'm talking about the 1990s, right? Early 90s and early 2000s. But take a look at it now. AT&T competes directly with the new version of Time Warner Cable, which is Spectrum. AT&T offers internet, telephone services, it offers TV, cable, and so does Time Warner. Spectrum offers telephone, the whole trifecta. So they're competing in the same space. And therefore industry boundaries are blurred, which increases the threat of substitutes. And just the threat of having substitutes affects the fierceness of competition. It caps prices, raises costs, and it has a huge effect on the industry. And also you have the threat of new entrants because of blurring industry boundaries. And finally, we look at legacy-free business models. You have Redbox, which is a substitute for Netflix, Uber, which is a substitute for car ownership. So legacy-free business models actually increase the threat of substitutes and the threat of new entrants. So let's talk a little bit about information technology and the way it affects the fierceness of competition. First is operational effectiveness. Information technology does increase your operational effectiveness, which allows you to reduce margins and affects the fierceness of competition. And the second one is to create barriers. Now, most strategic management textbooks will emphasize on kind of a brute force method to create entry barriers, like huge outlays of capital, like $10 billion in a microchip business, or having unique intellectual property like patents. But information technology actually allows you to create unconventional competitive barriers. Take the example of Facebook. Why have other Google came out with its own social media, but none of the other social media have that effect? Because Facebook went and captured the market, and it has what we call as critical mass. In spite of the scandals that Facebook have had with privacy, not many people are willing to get out of Facebook because everybody else is on Facebook. So sure, you can get out of Facebook and move to another social media, but then the whole purpose of social media is to connect with others, and if everybody else is in Facebook, who's going to make the first move? So information technology does create a lot of unconventional competitive barriers, which reduce customers' bargaining power and reduce the threat of new entrants. Now, you can replicate Facebook's technology, but you cannot replicate that critical mass which they have achieved without really deep pockets, and that helps with when you analyze the industry. So before you continue, pencil the names of your industry's major suppliers, substitutes, and arch rivals. So you already know your arch rivals, but look at your major suppliers and substitutes which are possible in your industry. I apologize for the last slide. I know that my my video camera was a little bit higher, so probably cut my face off. But I hope that doesn't affect the presentation. Let's continue with talking about the five forces model. And what you'll find is that the impact of the five forces can be analyzed if you look at it from the viewpoint of how it affects the margins. So the true test for competitive advantage is essentially having margins which is more than your arch rivals. Now, it's not just for-profit firms that need margins. Non-profits, governments, all need to have some kind of margins to have a future. And margins, if you look at it, is, the respectable range is what's defined by an industry. It's the difference between how much customers will pay and how much it costs you. And so if you look at this from the lens of the five forces model, more substitutes will reduce how much customers are willing to pay. New entrants reduce how much customers are willing to pay. More customer power reduces how much customers' bargaining power essentially reduces how much they're willing to pay. Supplier power increases how much it costs you. And how fierce the competition will more fiercer the competition will reduce how much customers pay and increase how much it's going to cost you. So taking again the five forces model, I want to reiterate that it analyzes an industry, not individual firm. Bargaining power is who gets more clout to force prices down. Substitutes rarely come from inside the industry, usually comes from outside the industry. And the mere threat of new entrants will automatically cap prices and raise costs. So it's not just new entrants, but also threat of substitutes. So the threat is good enough for firms to react to what's going to happen. So the bottom line is that fiercer competition will squeeze margins, and you will, as a firm, be forced to pass more value to the customers or spend more competing. And it really makes an industry attractive. You could take an attractive industry, and when competition increases, it can make it unattractive. High growth industry is unattractive if margins are unsustainable. So now let's look at how information technology affects an industry. And so here we have the four issues: threat of substitutes, suppliers' bargaining power, customers' bargaining power, threat of new entrants. And managers cannot control these issues. It increases transparency, erases geography, blurs industry boundaries, and also creates legacy-free business models. Increased transparency reduces suppliers' bargaining power, but increases customers' bargaining power. Not having geographic boundaries increases the suppliers' and customers' bargaining power. Blurring industry boundaries increases the threat of substitutes and new entrants, and having legacy-free business models increases the threat of substitutes and new entrants. But here are some of the things that managers can control. IT increases operational effectiveness and creates unconventional competitive barriers. And creating unconventional competitive barriers reduces the customer's bargaining power, and also reduces the threat of new entrants because it's hard to replicate when it's not just easy to spend money and get it. It's hard to replicate that particular knowledge. And sometimes it's the information and the analytics you gain, insight you gain about customers, which is hard to replicate.